Hope, in its purest form, is supposed to heal. But in this story, it threatens to tear everything apart. When Lily Winters receives the long-awaited confirmation that Kane Ashby is a perfect bone marrow match for Malcolm Winters, what should have been a moment of overwhelming relief quickly mutates into something far darker, far more dangerous. Beneath the surface of this life-saving miracle lies a storm of unresolved betrayal, buried resentment, and emotional scars that refuse to stay hidden. Because this is not just about saving a life, it is about reopening wounds that never truly healed. The man who now holds the power to save Malcolm is the same man whose past choices shattered trust and left lasting damage in Lily's world. Gratitude becomes a burden, forgiveness feels like a betrayal of pain, and every step toward the operating room becomes a step deeper into emotional chaos. The closer they get to hope, the more fragile everything becomes. As pressure builds and time runs out, each character is pushed toward a breaking point where decisions are no longer guided by logic, but by anger, guilt, and desperation. The line between sacrifice and self-interest begins to blur, raising a haunting question. Does this miracle come from genuine redemption, or is it another chapter in a cycle of control and consequence? In a world where loyalty is tested and trust is a luxury no one can afford, the truth behind this life-saving match may be more explosive than the crisis itself. Relief did not arrive gently. It crashed into Lily Winters with a force that left her breathless and unsteady. For days that had felt like years, she had lived suspended between hope and dread, watching the life of Malcolm Winters slip through fragile medical charts and uncertain prognoses. Every second had carried the weight of potential loss, every update threatening to shatter what little composure she had left. And then, suddenly, there it was. The answer no one had dared to expect. Kane Ashby was a match. The word itself should have felt like salvation. Instead, it triggered something far more complicated, because this was not just a medical miracle, it was a reckoning. For a brief, disorienting moment, Lily allowed herself to feel the relief. It spread through her like warmth after a long, brutal winter, loosening the tight grip of fear that had defined her every thought. Malcolm had a chance now, a real chance. But relief was quickly followed by something sharper, something harder to contain: memory. Kane's name carried weight, history, and wounds that had never truly healed. His presence had once been a source of stability, of love, of shared dreams that now felt distant and distorted. But it had also been a source of betrayal, choices made in secrecy, trust broken in ways that could not simply be undone by time. The idea that the same man who had once fractured her world was now the one capable of saving Malcolm's life felt almost cruel in its irony. That irony settled into something darker: obligation. Lily understood, with painful clarity, what this meant. Accepting Kane's role as the donor was not just about consenting to a procedure. It was about reopening doors she had spent years trying to close. It meant allowing him back into a space that had been defined by absence, forcing herself to confront emotions she had carefully buried beneath layers of anger and self-preservation. Gratitude was expected, perhaps even demanded by circumstance. But gratitude did not erase resentment. It did not silence the voice inside her that reminded her of everything that had been lost because of him. Across the hospital corridors, the tension radiated outward, touching everyone connected to the situation. For Malcolm, though physically weakened, the knowledge of Kane's compatibility carried its own psychological burden. Survival now depended on someone whose relationship with the family was anything but simple. The idea of owing his life to Kane created a quiet, internal conflict, one that blended pride with vulnerability. It forced him to confront the uncomfortable reality that survival often came at a cost, and that cost was rarely just physical. Kane, on the other hand, stood at the center of a storm he could neither control nor escape. Being a match should have been a straightforward act of humanity, a chance to do something undeniably right. But nothing about his history with Lily or the Winters family allowed for simplicity. The moment he was identified as the donor, his past surged forward, refusing to remain buried. Every mistake, every betrayal, every moment of selfishness resurfaced with brutal clarity. What should have been an opportunity for redemption instead felt like a test he was destined to fail. Because deep down, Kane understood that saving Malcolm would not automatically restore what had been broken. It would not erase the damage he had caused or guarantee forgiveness. In fact, it might do the opposite. It might trap him in a position where his act of sacrifice would always be viewed through the lens of his past, where every gesture of goodwill would be questioned, dissected, and ultimately diminished. That awareness bred a quiet frustration, one that grew into anger, not directed outward, but inward. He had the power to save a life, yet he had no power to change how that act would be perceived. The imbalance was suffocating. Meanwhile, Lily's internal conflict intensified with each passing hour. The closer they moved toward the procedure, the more she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crack. She found herself questioning not just Kane's motives, but her own. Was she willing to accept his help purely for Malcolm's sake? Or was there a part of her that still longed for something more? For closure? For resolution? Perhaps even for a version of the past that no longer existed? That question unsettled her more than anything else, because it exposed a vulnerability she had worked tirelessly to suppress. The hospital became a pressure cooker of unspoken emotions. Every glance carried meaning. Every silence stretched unbearably thin. The anticipation of the surgery did not bring comfort. It amplified the tension, turning every moment into a countdown, not just to a medical procedure, but to an emotional confrontation that none of them were prepared for. Complicating everything further were the whispers of doubt that began to surface around the edges of certainty. Medical miracles, after all, were rarely free of risk. The procedure, though promising, was not guaranteed. The possibility of failure lingered in the background, a shadow that refused to disappear. And with it came a terrifying realization. If something went wrong, the fragile balance they were struggling to maintain would collapse completely. For Lily, that possibility was unbearable. It forced her to confront a scenario in which she would lose Malcolm despite everything, and still be left with the unresolved presence of Kane in her life. The thought ignited a surge of anger, not just at the situation, but at the universe itself for placing her in such an impossible position. She began to question everything: the timing, the circumstances, the cruel symmetry of it all. It felt less like fate, and more like a calculated test of her limits, pushing her toward a breaking point she could no longer avoid. Kane, sensing the tension but unable to fully bridge the gap, found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to remain composed only deepened the sense of distance between him and everyone else. He was both essential and unwanted, necessary yet resented. That paradox became his reality, shaping every thought, every action, every moment of hesitation. And beneath it all, a darker question began to take shape, one that no one dared to voice, but that lingered in the silence between them. What if this wasn't just about saving Malcolm? What if this was about something else entirely? About power, control, redemption, and the subtle ways in which people manipulate circumstances to serve their own needs? The idea was unsettling, but it refused to fade. It cast doubt on intentions, turning even the most selfless act into something that could be interpreted as strategic, calculated, or even self-serving. As the day of the surgery approached, the emotional stakes reached a breaking point. There was no longer any room for avoidance, no more time to hide behind distractions or half-truths. Every character was forced to confront the reality of their situation, to face the consequences of their past decisions and the weight of the choices they were about to make. For Lily, it meant standing at the intersection of anger and necessity, forced to accept help from someone she was not ready to forgive. For Kane, it meant stepping into a role that demanded everything from him while offering no guarantee of redemption. For Malcolm, it meant placing his life in the hands of a man whose presence symbolized both hope and conflict. And for all of them, it meant recognizing that survival, if it came, would not mark the end of their struggles. It would only mark the beginning of something far more complicated, because in a world defined by tangled relationships and unresolved pain, even a miracle can become a source of division. Even an act of salvation can carry the weight of resentment. And even the promise of a second chance can force people to confront truths they would rather leave buried. The surgery promised hope. But hope, in this case, came at a cost none of them were truly prepared to pay.